Minutes.
I second.
Is your microphone on?
I second.
Thank you.
Normal standard procedure is to have a open public comment area. I'm seeing no public. Let's move forward.
You just need to take a vote. All
What's
in
that?
favor? You need to take a
All in
vote on
favor?
that.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, I have a comment before we actually vote on this. And I do apologize. I'm having a little congestion here, so bear with me.
Okay.
We were discussing the utility rates, and I just didn't see it in the minutes, but I just want to have it for clarification. And Jim, when we spoke about whether we use the county's system or our county or our system, I believe we had a discussion, and you had shared with us that there was no financial difference regardless of whether we went with the system that we have or converted over to the county system or some similar system.
We're talking about
Water and sewer. I apologize. Yes.
The GAI study showed us that it was total revenue stream was a positive 2% coming to the city in the unincorporated and the South Beach area. It was a negative right at 1% in Indian River Shores. So it was really a wash because a lot of it depends on consumption more than anything else. But yes, the GAI study backs up that only thing the different rate structures do is shift who's paying.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure we had that in the notes.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, I just would want to make a point, Jim, if you could mention that part of that structure is the difference between rates for large commercial users as opposed to residential between the county and the city, that the county's rates are more substantial for high user, generally business, and lower for residential low users. So they're part of the differential is not only the comparison of percentage, but the shift of who bears the total cost.
That is correct. Our two different rate structures are inverse of each other. We have placed the cost on the cost of service, i.e. the lower end users, so therefore the mere fact that we had to build a water plant to serve water. So the concept is we placed the cost burden there and then gave the sort of the economy of scale, if you want to use that, for higher end. The county, on the other hand, has reversed that and said just providing the water is not their big cost. It's providing capacity for heavy users, so therefore they shifted, and so you pay more per unit on the top end for the county and less per unit for the city on the top end. Does that explain it to you, Peter?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to chairman matters. Peter, do you have anything you want to put in?
Not at this point. I said you will address it.
We didn't vote.
You're the chairman today.
Okay.
There was something that he had asked me to address on his behalf later on, so when we get to finance director's matters, I'll take care of it for him.
All right. Then let's move on to new business. Who's got it?
I believe we stopped the vote. We kind of voted, but we didn't. Let's just make it clear to approve the minutes.
Okay. Got him?
So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, we're good.
Just a point of clarification, because the rules were written prior to the internet age, I am not permitted to either make a motion or to vote since I am not present. Only were I in the hospital be able to do that, but just for clarification. So I can comment, but I can neither make a motion nor vote.
We understand, Peter.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any new business on the table? Anybody?
No.
I guess you've got new business. You got the accountants here, or do you want to wait on that?
my matters are all under finance director's matters,
All right.
those 4 items on the agenda, so.
Any old business we need to discuss? If not, let's move on to the finance matters. You're going to carry item A.
The first thing that we have on the agenda today is a review of our comprehensive annual financial report, our CAFR, for the fiscal year that ended last September 2013. And I'm hoping that for the sake of today's discussion, everyone does have a hard copy of that document with them. We have our principals from Raymond, Margot Lind, and Ross Cotherman, who I think many of you know, who worked with the city in preparing this CAFR this year. But I would like to take a couple of minutes, if I could, and just point out a couple of areas in the CAFR that speak to some of the things that we've been working on as Finance Commission for the last few years, chat about those a little, and then have Ross and Margot add anything else they'd like to add about it, as well as just any questions that you might have. This is not necessarily in order of importance, but in order in the book, so that'll make it easier as we flip through. So if we could, let's find the statements that are located on pages 40 to 47 of the CAFR that you have in front of you. And we'll be talking about the city's enterprise fund.
I'm sorry, Cindy, what was that again? I'm
Pages
having
40
a difficult time hearing you.
Pages 40 to 47, and in particular, if we would, just go to page 44.
Thank you.
Got everyone there. This particular page is for all of the city's enterprise funds, the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position. This used to be called changes in net assets, which made a lot more sense to me, but for some reason Gatsby decided to change that because that's how they roll. So anyway, we have operating revenues and expenses. Then we have non-operating items such as interest expense and contributions and transfers. And finally, we have what's called the change in net position, used to be called change in net assets. So I want to point out a couple of things about our various enterprise funds. If you go down to the bottom of the page, change in net position, left to right, we have some enterprise funds that are in extremely good shape. Our electric system, for the second year in a row, has a reasonable positive net increase in assets of just over $1 million, which is very different than the situation we had a couple of years back when it was minus 1.9. So as we've discussed during rate making, we have a reasonable margin, and we're showing a positive building and increase there, partly because of rate sufficiency and partly because of investment in capital. Our water and sewer system, same thing down there, about a $1.3 million increase in net position. The municipal airport is doing extremely well with almost $1 million increase in net position. Again, they have a bit of a operating loss, but they get quite a number of capital grants, and a huge part of their ongoing program is investing in upgrades of runways and the things that they're doing out there at the airport, which are worth their while today as the Blue Angels are out there having a good time. Now we come to a couple that are getting better, but still not great. The municipal marina, last year it had a decrease in net position of about $30,000, so that's an improvement to only $2,000 in the current year. Their revenues seem to be picking up, and lots more people in the marina, so we expect that to continue to improve. Solid waste is in great shape, an increase of about $400,000, and recreation. You know, the recreation fund is something that we've talked about in the past. In the year that you see in front of you, they had a $283,000 loss. And if you go a couple of pages back to the balance sheets, currently has a $224,000 deficit unrestricted net asset position. And the real reason for this, and we explain it in the notes because we have to, is that we only transfer enough to the recreation department to cover its cash flow needs. As we all know, it's not self-supporting. But we treat it, for accounting purposes, as an enterprise fund. So we don't give it enough revenue to cover the non-cash expense of depreciation, which in this case is about $350,000 a year. It doesn't have any assets at the end of the year to cover its liability for compensated absences or any of its other liabilities. And on top of it, for a good number of years, we haven't really made any investment in capital. So you see that the investment in capital, net of depreciation, continues to decline. And I think that this position right here, particularly for last fiscal year, brings something to the forefront that we have talked about before, which is I don't think that the recreation fund is really an enterprise fund. You know, an enterprise fund in the government accounting world is designed to account for something that is treated like a business, that supports itself through user fees or revenues that are generated by the operation. And certainly the electric utility or the airport or the marina fit that category. But as we've talked about before, I just do not think that recreation does. And so, I think this bears that out. It's not going to get better. It's going to continue to get worse. And so as a result, I think maybe it's something that we want to consider as we budget for 14-15. Maybe it's time to roll that into the general fund as another department and stop treating it as an enterprise fund to leave it in a position. Now, you know, in the government-wide statements, it'll still have to show its depreciation, et cetera, but casting it in this manner just makes it look worse and worse, and it's not going to get worse. It's going to continue to get better. I mean, better. It'll get worse. So anyway, that's just a thought, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more as we talk about budgets.
But excuse me if I may, just by treating it like that, don't you realize the true cost of what it is?
Well,
I don't want to bury it somewhere else where it becomes a small part of a much larger fund and kind of gets pushed to the side and not realized.
and that's a reasonable concern. If we put it into the general fund, it would not get absorbed. In other words, it would remain its own department. Okay? So you could clearly see the recreation department. What would not happen, though, is that we would not allocate portions of HR, finance, clerk, administration to it as we do currently, because it would be sitting in the general fund with those costs. But again, you know, I guess it's more of a philosophy thing. It isn't, nor was it ever designed to be self-supporting any more than the police department is or the administrative functions of the city are. It's heavily subsidized by ad valorem taxes, and that's essentially what a general fund is for. You know, I mean, you can see clearly in the general fund the costs of the police department, the costs of recreation, but things like the administrative costs are in their own departments, city attorney to city clerk. So, I mean, it's kind of, my understanding, and I don't know if anybody has any more on this, but the reason it got created as an enterprise fund in the first place years ago was because the county actually gave the city money to support recreation, and they insisted that at the time that, you know, it be accounted for in a way where they could see exactly how the money was being spent. But, you know, that time is long since gone, and I would submit probably not coming back anytime soon. And it just, you know.
The other alternative we talked about before is it sort of hides the real cost of running the city. By sticking in another division like this, it might be more helpful to the taxpayers if it clearly saw that money was going out the door for recreation funds. I think that'd be helpful. It is on the financial statement, but it is in a transfer format, which, you know, to a person that doesn't read the financial statement very well, it sort of hides it.
And that transfer.
Mr. Chairman, the other thing, Cindy, that it doesn't do, it doesn't show the revenue stream. So when you're looking at it in a budget component like you were talking about, you're just going to see the money that's been budgeted there. You don't see any revenues coming into that particular budget as you would in an enterprise fund. And,
but we
and
will.
that would sort of mask what you were just saying, that is it really making money? Is how much are we putting into it? Now, certainly you could bump the budget up to accommodate it.
Well, it does have some of its own revenues.
Yeah.
And when we absorbed it into the general fund, those revenue line items like recreation sponsorships, et cetera, would continue to be distinct line items in the general fund revenues. Mm-hmm. So you'd be able to see the revenue-specific recreation items. But the answer is, the difference between that small amount of money, which in the prior fiscal year was $560,000, and the $2 million cost of recreation is entirely general revenues from the general fund in one big lump of a transfer. So, you know, I see what you're saying, but, you know, again, and that's what this comes down to, partly. You know, it's a little bit philosophical, it's a little bit Gatsby, because it's really hard to continue to sell the idea that this is an enterprise fund. It really doesn't much meet the definition.
Is there a definition of an enterprise fund?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is an enterprise fund?
It's essentially, in a nutshell, a fund that's accounted for separately because it's run like a business, and it's designed to pay for itself through user fees and cost recovery, or some other kind of revenue source that's specific to that department's fund.
So by that definition, this wouldn't be an enterprise fund?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if Ross wants to elaborate on that, but that's essentially the definition. And
No, I agree with you. I mean, that's the definition. Before GASB 34, when we had these government-wide financial statements where we added the fixed assets and depreciated them, I mean, that was why you had really the enterprise set up, because they functioned as a business that, as strange as it sounds, had debt and fixed assets and depreciation expense in the enterprise fund, where you did not have that in the general fund. But that is the definition, and the recreation probably is not meeting that definition any longer.
Yeah, that changed, I think, back early 80s when they started rolling that out. But, the enterprise fund essentially it would be like a cantina, something that you would expect that would have some sort of funds available, and they would earn money and they would spend money. My concern is that, when we get ready to make budget reductions when we have to, I was sitting in here when they had the discussion about reducing some budget in the recreation department, and of course there was a large outcry from that, understandably so. This, I think, while it borders on is it or is it not, I think highlights that the recreation department doesn't support itself on a yearly basis. So however you want to consider that down the road, whether we want to leave it as an enterprise fund or roll it into a department within the general operating fund, I think would be something for discussion.
Yeah. But, again, philosophically, on the flip side, the police department's another prime example with expenses almost 3 times of recreation, not even remotely self-supporting. And it's a general fund department. And again, the council has undertaken over the years to make good decisions about the level of police services that they want, regardless of the fact that it isn't and never will be self-supporting. It's highly supported by taxes. So, but I think it's a discussion worth having. I think rather than just leave it this way, because it's always been that way, as we move forward into the coming budget season, I'd like to have this discussion with the Finance Commission, and I'll give you some time to think about it, have it with the council, and let's make a policy decision whether we want to just keep doing it this way or whether it does make sense, given all the considerations that you've brought up, which are good ones.
I think Cindy is pointing out, though, that as a department, it does have some separate accounting, so the numbers will not be buried. But then it gets down to what is the philosophy of the city? Do they feel they have an obligation to provide recreation? And if they do, then it's part of the general fund, if it's not outside their mission. So, if you felt you had no responsibility to provide recreation and could just do away with it entirely, then then maybe you'd want to treat it separately. But if it's going to be part of the city's mission, then, I would be for consolidating it.
Yeah. Of course, if we leave it as an enterprise fund, maybe someone will come and offer to buy it from this.
If you were going to set this up, this system as a new enterprise, if you just came in to set up an accounting system here, would you split out this as one of the enterprise units, or would you not? You would not. Okay.
It's really sort of stayed that way because it's always been that way, and there were reasons for it when it first got made that way, but it's just getting harder to justify. So anyway, just point of thought, think about that and the different good points, bad points to doing it the other way. And as we move through our budget adoption for 14-15, I think we should make a proactive decision about whether we keep doing it this way or not for 14.
Cindy, didn't you a couple of years back separate the park care out?
We did.
A couple of years ago, the park care was in the recreation department budget, right?
Mm-hmm. And then
a couple of years back, we separated it out. Mm-hmm. So this is really, as near as you can get, true cost of recreation, not grounds upkeep, building upkeep. That was separated out a couple of years back. Correct?
Great point. And it was absorbed back into the general fund.
I think it was 2 years back or 3 years back. I don't know.
It was absorbed back into the general fund. The distinction being that if it was simple, open green space that people could do whatever they wanted to, like Riverside Park, it was the maintenance was absorbed back into the general fund because it wasn't a recreation function. The only maintenance that's still in this enterprise fund is active maintenance of active managed recreational facilities like Leisure Square and the tennis complex. So we did already sort of move in that direction to take back the things that weren't specifically recreation.
Right.
If we did take it out of an enterprise fund, put it in a regular fund, wouldn't we budget initially at the beginning of the year to have a zero balance at the end of the year?
Well, what would happen is it would absorb back into the general fund, and it would just be another general fund department, and the general fund would budget to not erode its overall fund balance every year. It would be just like police, public works. It would just be another department, and all the revenues, including the specific revenues, would be in the general fund revenues. And at the end of the year, you want revenues equal to or greater
balance
than
that,
expenses.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, that being said, my concern is that if it zeroes out, you won't see the true cost of it at this negative, whatever it is, 283.
Actually, the true cost of it, I would say.
Well,
I
we'll
would
say the
submit to you-
negative balance, the loss on it.
I would submit to you that the true cost is the transfer in of $1.6 million that's required to actually keep it going. If you look down there, that $1.6 million is what the general fund, or not just the general fund, but mostly the general fund transfers into recreation to keep it going, and it still ends up negative because of the depreciation expense, which isn't cash.
Okay, well then even more so on that point.
You wouldn't see that. It wouldn't be
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know how to say this diplomatically, but people complain about the fees they pay for the pool, for this, for that, and I don't think they realize that that's a pittance of what it really costs to run those things.
Right.
And if you take this away, then it's really going to go away, and you'll never realize it. So, okay, I don't want to beat a dead horse. Let's move
No,
on.
you make a good point. I mean, it will take that away. Unfortunately, and maybe they can weigh in on this, up till a couple of years ago, we would have had a third option, and we could have made it a separate special revenue fund, a governmental fund, where it wouldn't be cast in these terms in the governmental balance sheets, but where we could segregate it. Unfortunately, now we can't really create new special revenue funds unless the residual fund balance every year is restricted by law to be spent on that purpose. So that's not really, and I don't know if they agree, but that's not really an option for me now to make it a special revenue fund, which is what I would have suggested 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
Cindy, just one more quick comment. The depreciation wouldn't appear if it was rolled into the general fund, as a department in the general fund. So that depreciation number would go away. This is not going to end in the red anyway. They're going to put sufficient money in to cover the budget before the end of the year, correct?
No. We put in enough money to cover the cash flow needs. The general fund has not given it enough money to cover the non-cash depreciation expense and to have a residual balance to cover its liabilities at the end of the year, like compensated absences. Basically, we're running this to the bone. We do the budget on a cash basis, and whatever they're going to spend, minus whatever specific revenues they take in, that's all we transfer. To make it look good as an enterprise fund would require the general fund to begin to contribute probably close to $400,000 a year more to recreation than it is, simply because of the accounting convention. And I would say that's going to be a harder sell than rolling it back into the general fund.
Okay, so, pardon me. So what you're saying to me is that it will end in the red each year because it's an enterprise fund?
Did last year, did this year.
So that would show what you were concerned about, that would be to show the true picture.
Exactly, that's what I'm looking for.
But unfortunately, too, I will let you know, depending on how this continues to grow, if you look at the unrestricted net asset deficit of $224,000, there are also some rules regarding states of your financial state with the Auditor General, where you sum up all of your unrestricted balances, deficit and positive, and it has to be a pretty decent number. So again, down the road, if we were to sell the electric utility, and that goes off these books, and this continues to grow by a couple $100,000 every year, there will come a point where, in combination of all the enterprise funds, it would begin to cause a problem. That's way down the road, but again, it's another consideration. So,
okay, but if you roll it into the general fund, Cindy, then you won't end the year with a negative.
It'll just be another general fund.
You see what I'm saying?
Now, the depreciation expense
So the general fund would contribute whatever it takes to bring that fund out of the negative at the end of the year.
But it's also a positive, because it does show clearly what's going on within the city. And it's doubtful a lot of people get into this depth of the financial statements. They don't really see the true cost of running the department. Come on, man. I mean, if it's in the general fund, they get a glimpse of that, and when the reality is, the real cost to the city is being obscured a little bit by pushing it off. The real cost of it was about $2 million, and it's got down to about $1.4 million or thereabouts. And And that's been tough to get to, without a doubt.
But as Cindy said, that could be true of the police department too. So do you want to set up an enterprise fund for the police department and every single activity that the general
I
fund
don't
does?
agree with that because you don't have money coming into the police department, do you?
The police department, if I took the police department expenditures and then I took the revenues in the general fund directly attributable to them, like fines and forfeitures and things like that, the difference between their expenses and that little bit of revenue that's directly attributable to them is fairly substantial, bigger than this. And it's, I guess, not to pick on them, it's the whole reason you have a general fund. Nothing in a general fund is expected to support itself through user-specific revenues.
Right, I
It
understand that,
has
but they
to
don't have
taxes.
people paying in fees or dues to the police department. That's a said budgeted item that we put in.
But you do. You have fines, our share of fines and forfeitures. You have, some of the burglar alarm inspection fees. I mean, there are revenue line items in the general fund that are specific to the police department in that they have to all be in general fund revenues, but we wouldn't have them coming in if we didn't have a police department. So, it'd be a similar situation. Again, it is very, very much, I think, what I hear from all of you, it's two things. One, it's nobody wants to lose sight of the fact of how much it costs us out of our tax dollars, because that's essentially what it is, to support our recreation department. And I understand that. Although I would
Many of which are county residents.
Yeah, I would agree with the chairman's comment that probably no one pays as much attention to it as we do. But it is poignant when it's a separate fund. And the other thing is, philosophically, what's the purpose of a general fund? It is to pay for things, as Ms. Barton pointed out, that you think are your duty to provide as a government, even if it costs tax dollars to do it. So it's a worthwhile discussion to keep having. I think we really need to, if anything, even if we're going to leave it this way, we should leave it this way because we thought about it and we talked about it and we decided to leave it this way, and not just because it keeps rolling down the road every year, same as last year. So
we can certainly make that decision as we get to budget time.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment, please? Hello? My comment is that if at some point in the future there is a requirement to issue debt for the recreation facilities and you have to go to the bond market, what is the impact of having this depreciation loss on the balance sheet each year if one has to go out and put a new roof or put a new extension to Leisure Square or whatever? Is that at all important?
Well, it's a good question, and it's important in this way. And it, again, I think, adds to the argument that recreation shouldn't be an enterprise fund. The other enterprise funds go out to the bond market and they pledge their revenues. They pledge excess water and sewer utility revenues or electric utility revenues, and they get money against that. They get borrowing, and that's the guarantee of repayment. The recreation fund would have to, if it wanted to issue any debt, all of its capital is paid for out of our 1 cent sales tax, and those are general taxes, and those general taxes would be the only thing that we would be able to pledge and get any kind of a loan for recreation. Recreation doesn't have any of its own user fees to pledge.
At the end of the day, it's a general fund loan. We're kidding ourselves otherwise.
It's general government revenue funds that would guarantee a loan for the recreation department. Again, lending credence to the fact that it's not an enterprise fund. Every other enterprise fund here could get a loan on its own merit with its own revenues.
Dan, you had a question?
Well, I think we ought to stick to the definition of an enterprise fund. I mean, to try and lump a police department in as an enterprise fund, I think it's too attenuated. And the purpose of having a police department is one of the basic purposes of having a city, municipality, to protect the people. Excuse me. These other funds here, purpose of our electric system, obviously, is to raise money for this city. And same with water and sewer. One fund I think that should, if you want to stretch the limit of an enterprise fund, the cemetery is omitted here. I mean, that is a basic purpose, to raise money fees for having a cemetery. That's not on here. Recreation, I don't know, that's just something, that's an expense that we provide to our residents and even non-residents, but that doesn't make any money. I mean, to speak of.
The cemetery is actually separated out as what's known as a permanent fund. So it's a slightly different category because of the nature of like the permanent endowments when people pay for grave sites, but it is segregated as a separate fund. but not here in the enterprise funds, in the permanent funds in special revenue. But you're right. I mean, I don't know. Again, it's hard to know
I
which
think
way
it's
to
much
do it.
easier to put recreational expenses in the general fund than it is as a separate, because they never make a profit.
Yeah, I had just one point to consider. Also, you're talking about changing if you went to the general fund and the depreciation expense. Of course, if it was in the general fund, then it would be part of your capital projects, and perhaps you'd even spend or pay more attention to the needs and the future needs for 3, 5, 10 years out to add it to your capital projects as well. So, just a consideration, just something to think about, that it would be included as part of that expenditure or that budgeting process as well.
Enough discussion on it? We're obviously not going to make a decision today on that.
Just
So
food,
it's okay.
just food for thought. I mean, because I think
it's worth considering.
We've talked about it a bunch
Yeah.
of times over the years, and now's our opportunity to make a decision because we're in the process of budgeting for 14-15. So just that
Okay.
to think about. The second thing, and this is always a big favorite for everyone, if you go to page 93, I guess is the best place to start. Let's talk about the pensions a little bit. On page 93, you'll see a page called Required Supplementary Information. And if you turn to the next page, you'll see some of the kind of the key stats on where we are with the pensions on page 94. We had a good news, bad news year with our general employee pension. We had a very substantial increase in our funded ratio. And if you look at the bottom of that chart at the top there, as of October 1, 2013 valuation, we have increased it to a 62% funded ratio, which is a little over a 3% increase from the prior year. That's mostly because we finally finished, we've talked about how we do that 5-year smoothing of losses and gains so that we don't have huge swings. We've finished getting rid of all our bad losses from 2008, and 2 years in a row we've had fairly substantial returns on a market basis and therefore on an actuarial basis. And as a cushion, we have a few more years worth of unrealized gains from the last 2 years that are being smoothed out over 5 years. So our actuary, who came and gave a presentation to our General Employee Pension Board a week ago, or actually this week I think it was, and Mr. Old was there, feels good about that part of it and about the fact that we've got that cushion for the coming years, and should we continue to experience some reasonable gains, we'll be gaining on this funded percentage again. So that's the good news. Kind of the bad news, and I think I gave you guys a copy of the separate memo that I put with the valuation report, is that because of a Florida statute requirement that says if you have an assumed payroll growth as part of your valuation assumptions, and 10 years go by and you don't realize that assumed payroll growth, in that 10th year, there's a reckoning where you have to go ahead and say it didn't happen, it's not going to. And what that really does, in a nutshell, is affect your amortization payments of your unfunded liability. And so as a result, our payment for next year did not go down. It went up by about $330,000 citywide, with an impact of about $117,000 to the general fund. And I felt the same way when I read the valuation. So it is one of those things where, again, based on the conversation we had with our actuary at the pension board meeting, the city has done a really good and responsible job of making its annual required contributions every year. This is something that a lot of governments did not do or shirked, much to their dismay, but we have every single year, and this shows on that page as well. You can see back as far as 2008, we have made 100% of the actuarial required contribution to include not only our normal contributions, but paying off that unfunded liability. Right now, our amortization period on that unfunded liability, instead of being 20 or 30 or 40 years, our actuary said he had some clients who stretched that out to 49 years. Ours is an average of 13-year time frame. So in the next decade or so, with reasonable assumptions, we should be back in a place where we're up over 90% funding. In conjunction with all of this, as you know, we're currently in the process of trying to freeze this defined benefit plan and therefore stop the growth of the liability and move to a defined contribution plan. So that's kind of where we sit with that. The police officers' pension fund is here on the next page. They actually had a good year as well, and they also have finished amortizing the losses from prior years, so they're back up to 81% funded, and their annual required contribution for the coming fiscal year is held pretty steady with the 887. So, and then we have, I think you all know this, we have a small firefighters' pension fund left from back in the day when we had firefighters, and that one's in 83% funded, and it's relatively small. There's no new entrants to that pension program. There's only retirees, so that one's in pretty good shape. The biggest thing that we're looking forward to, though, is another GASB pronouncement that we have to implement for the fiscal year that ends in 14-15, and it will change completely the way that we account for pensions. Right now, on our balance sheets, if we make our actuarially required contribution every single year, we're not required to show any sort of a net liability for our pensions, even for the unfunded liability on our balance sheets. In a nutshell, and Ross and Margot can speak to this more, the new GASB pronouncement requires that we show the entire unfunded, the market value of the entire unfunded liability on our balance sheets. And more importantly, it sort of uncouples that market value away from the way we do it with our actuary now, where we have 5-year smoothing, where we make actuarially required contributions based on amortizing over 10 years, et cetera. Now, the way we account for it will be different than the way we're going to suggest that we fund for it. We're going to suggest that we continue to do what we've done all along to get back to a fully funded position. But our books will show the market value, meaning when we have a great investment year, it'll go up. And when we have a terrible investment year, it'll go, and just all over the place, making it look as though the contributions we're making should be zero in some years or bigger in others. And so even though we have to account for it that way, one of the things that I want to bring forward in the coming year is a formal pension funding policy to be reviewed by you and adopted by the council that says, regardless of how the GASB wants us to account for it, we want to continue to stay on the path we're on, have an actuarial valuation every year that gives us a required contribution in the same terms, and continue to make those required contributions till we get back to fully funded status, and not let the new way of accounting for it fool us into thinking that we're having a good year and we don't have to put money in. I mean, I think essentially that's how I would describe it. And I don't know if you want to add to that. So.
No, a nice summary there. That's perfect.
When you say
I've got a question. Are all our employees on the defined benefit plan, or is it just the police department?
All of our employees, but they're two separate plans. So what we're trying to do is freeze the general employee defined benefit plan and move all those employees to a defined contribution plan as part of our union negotiation. But the police department pension is a defined benefit plan and a completely separate plan. And it is funded in part by revenues from insurance premiums. So there are some different rules about what we're allowed to do with that one. So the move is to take the general employee plan, freeze it, but to leave the police pension, at least for now, to leave the police pension plan alone because it's funded a different way.
Excuse me, the police pension also gets a contribution from the state.
Right, they get insurance premium taxes. And accepting that money puts some limitations on what we, the city, can do to modify that plan. So,
does that include the liabilities you have to show? Does that include post-employment benefits?
We're about to talk about that. What a great segue. That's another one. Other post-employment benefits has been a struggle for us for a few years. This is, again, a fairly recent GASB pronouncement that says that because we offer subsidized health insurance to retirees, and we pay for that every single year, we make our contribution, but because we do, that we now have to go have an actuary calculate for us on an actuarial basis what the accumulated future liability is of offering those benefits. We, like many other governments, are still allowed to continue to pay for that on a pay-as-you-go basis. Every single year, we budget what we need to pay for our share of retiree premiums, and we pay it. But now we have to show that liability on our books. And if you look at page 97, that's probably a pretty good recap of where we are. We had a new actuary do their thing for us this year, a really good, thorough actuarial evaluation, a big improvement over our last one. But unfortunately, we still are in a situation where that liability grew by another $2.6 million in the current year. If you look down at the bottom of page 97, 97, yeah. You can see kind of the annual required contributions. And if you look, I think 87 is a better page to help us with this one. If we want to turn back to page 87, this will help a little more. Our 3-year trend has been, an annual cost of 3.8, 3.9, 3.7 on an actuarial basis. And up there in the middle, an increase in our obligation of about 2.6, 3.1, 2.4, pretty steady, $2.6 million a year. Right now, the way that GASB has this is all we're required to report on our balance sheet is the accumulated unpaid obligation. So we're up to about 14 million on that right now, with it growing about 2.6 million every year. There is some talk that they may change this to be the same as the pension, in that we would have to show the entire unfunded liability on our books. And at this point in time, that entire unfunded liability runs up to around $55 million. And if you couple that with all of our unfunded pension liabilities, our government-wide balance sheet will not be pretty. But we will not be the only ones.
I added it up. It's $100 million.
I know.
No question about it.
It won't have it will have zero effect, and it does have zero effect, both of these things. Well, no, I take that back. The OPEB right now has zero effect on our cash and what we really have in the bank and what we really do every year, because we continue to budget and pay for our retiree premiums.
Yeah, but Cindy, that assumes a fair amount of growth. If you add up all the unfunded liability, it does amount to about $100 million. Mm-hmm. And if you add up the general employees and the police department and the fire department, and then add in for OBP or whatever it is, right? All total, it comes to close to $10 million, right? The three big ones are six. I mean, it was seven, right there at seven. Add the other one in, even not amortizing the $41 million that's not off the books yet, but 14 would be on the books, 41 would be off. Even amortizing that 14, we add another $3 million. So we're about $10 million plus or minus a few bucks.
Right.
And the problem with that, to summing down, I hate to say this too loud, but American corporations have been involved in the same situation. We got a federal government involved in the same situation. These are off-balance sheet liabilities that nobody has reported, and they flat do impact the long-term viability of the companies in the city. We're somehow going to have to be able to raise revenue enough to continue to carry these forward. And as some of these charts show, we've had some good stock years that has really benefited. Without Mr. Chairman of the Federal Reserve inflating the stock market, who knows what this negative would be. It would be different than it is today. We've had 2 or 3 years of really good stock market performance. Can we, and I think Mr. Buffett would say, can we really believe that that's going to be good going forward 10 years out? I don't know. That's a pretty risky deal.
The thing that's frustrating about the OPEB for me, and again, this is food for thought, and I'd like to provide you guys with a copy of the OPEB actuarial report, which was really well done.
You haven't seen that, right?
And because I don't think you've gotten that one yet, and we have a really good one, and a few other, I think, interesting articles from another perspective on the OPEB. First of all, one of the reasons that the actuarial valuation of OPEB is so high is that GASB insists that the actuaries take into account what they call an implicit rate subsidy, which says that if your retiree had to go out and get insurance on the open market without being part of your plan, they would pay a lot more for that insurance than they pay when they're part of your plan. And therefore, they adjust for the idea that their rates for insurance should be 3 times what it is for a 30-year-old, and they call that the real liability. And personally, I have a problem with that because insurance is pooled risk. That's the entire point. And the fact of the matter is they are in the city's plan. The place where it really, I think, would begin to endanger you is when you are no longer a going enterprise.
That's correct.
You've promised all of this to retirees, and now your mix of active employees and retirees goes sideways. That's where you would have a problem.
See, that's where I am in my head, because we have a locked-in city at so many acres, and look at our growth curve over the last 10 years. It's flat to down.
But if you look at the census of who's in and who's out, the ratio of active to retired participants in the pension plans is a really good about 50-50 now. And again, as long as you continue to have an ongoing government, you're going to have new people in the pension plan, and you're going to have retirees that pass out of the pension.
But the amount of contribution coming in from the employees is pretty marginal versus the cost of the growth rate of this thing. I mean, it's pretty hard to see when you look. I just calculated in my head that over the last, 6 years has been a growth in the actuarial fund by about, maybe 3% a year. And if you run over on the liability side, it's growing at the rate of 6 or 7.5%, 6 to 7%.
Are we on the pensions or the OPEB?
On the pension funds, it's hard to see it on OBEM or whatever you call that thing.
Again,
because we don't
the
have enough
numbers are
history.
kind
We
of
have the
obscure.
3-year history.
Exactly.
But obviously that was growing back up the 3 years. So, and any one fund you pick, you can see the same sort of thing. It looks like the growth in the assets is maybe 50% of the growth in the liabilities continuing. And those liabilities, at some point, have to be paid,
Well, they do, but again, if you look and this is one of the things the actuary talked about back on the general employee pension plan. Right now, the position that we're in, because we have a robust plan that has people coming in and people going out and ongoing contributions, is our annual contributions to that plan pretty much cover our annual outgoing cash flow. And we have a good balance of active and retiree participants that has stayed in a really good, 1-to-1 mix ratio over the last number of years. And all of the growth has actually grown the value and not been depleted. So right now, money coming in equals money going out.
Correct.
And all of the stock.
And I've looked at it. You're right.
Close the gap, and that's good. We have done, or we're trying to do, because we're negotiating in good faith, the one thing that we can do to fix the general employee pension situation, which is to freeze that plan and therefore the liabilities stop growing. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then continue to fund it properly, and we should be in a place within a decade, long before we have all the retirees out into the retirement part of the system, where our funded ratio is good again. And should we sell the electric utility or come into some other large quantity of funds, we could solve that problem even more quickly. But what'll happen, though, is that we won't have an active, robust plan anymore. So now the contributions going in will be against the unfunded liability, but that extra amount that goes in every year as new money will stop, and we will have to go back and examine our actuarial assumptions, lower our interest rate assumption, move our assets into slightly more conservative investments, because now there isn't going to be the same amount of new money going in, and so with each passing year we'll see a decline instead of cash in equaling cash out and everything else is growth. So I agree. On the pension thing, I think the city's we've done what we can to address it. We funded it responsibly for as long as we've needed to, and now we're doing our best to stop the growth.
Well, you can certainly make a case for making sure that all of the unfunded liabilities are on the balance sheet. The public has a right to know and has a responsibility to know when they're down here beating up you guys for more money to fund the parks and to do this and do that, and nobody understands the long-term problems of the balance sheet, and they're not disclosed.
Well, I will tell you, if
so,
if for some reason the GASB does decide that OPEB has to be cast in the same way, and even if they don't, there are some ways that you can tackle the OPEB thing. The easiest, most obvious way is, instead of funding it pay as you go, establish a trust and start putting money into the trust. It goes off balance sheet into a trust fund just like these and gets cast every year as an accumulated liability and assets and a value against them. The problem being, if you put that money into a trust, you can't have it back out.
Yeah, but isn't it easier, just be honest about it, isn't it easier for our elected officials, and us too, to hold costs down, even if they know they're accumulating liabilities over on the left side that nobody sees? And that's what's really going on. There's no doubt about what's going on. And it's allowing elected officials, in my opinion, it's happening at the state level, happens at the federal level, and allowing elected officials to get away with appeasing the taxpayers and not being real about the real cost of running a business. I mean, how do you accumulate $55 million in unfunded liabilities if you didn't underreport the expense of the city 10 years old?
I kind of think there's been a change in. I kind of think there's been a change in philosophy. I think for a long, going way back, I think people didn't think it was wrong to have future taxpayers or future employees paying for past employees' expenses.
I'm not being critical, what I'm saying.
And I think now it's very clear that people are saying, okay, let's currently expense what all the benefits are of an employee
Absolutely.
now, so that future taxpayers don't pay for.
So our kids know.
Yeah, and so the accounting is now catching up with that policy, and so we are going to have to deal with it. What I think worries people is the liability is going to be large, and so what happens, for instance, to net worth? I'm not sure it's called net worth, but if we have suddenly a charge of 100 in liability, what happens to net worth, and does that harm our borrowing ability and ability to perform? And that's tricky. There's no question about it.
Yeah, no question about it. You're right. The impact on our asset structure is pretty huge. The net worth of the city would be obliterated to some extent.
Well, no, because again, it will have zero impact on our cash, and it will not impact our enterprise funds. And as a result, and we will not be the only government in that situation.
No doubt.
And just a couple of things. I agree with you 100% when it comes to pensions. Pensions are a vested liability. The minute you accumulate them, you owe them. You have no opportunity to change the past and to say to people in the future, I'm not going to pay you what I said I owed you up to this point in time. And those are real liabilities based on a multiplier, age, and actuarial tables. When it comes to pensions, I agree with you 100%. When it comes to OPEB, I would respectfully submit that is overinflated, liability, because of the assumption of the implicit rate subsidy, that retiree subsidies of health care are under the city's control far more than the vested legal right to a pension, because we can change health insurance plans, we can lower health insurance costs, we can, things like that. So I would tell you there's probably a lot of finance directors that get real passionate on the OPEB subject, because pensions, I absolutely agree. OPEB, I think it came up out of nowhere. I think GASB stepped into policy making and overstepped their bounds, and I think that what they've created doesn't actually send their message, because what you're going to do is you're going to cause every government in the country to show a massive instantaneous overnight liability on their balance sheet, and the fact is, if everyone does it, it will have zero impact, because it will be meaningless in context. Everybody's going to have a crisis.
Well, if it's going to have zero impact on then that's the reason for doing it, because it doesn't affect anybody's real thinking. But the reality is our corporations did that, correct? They've done that. They've had to. Now, I would agree it's caused problems, because you're right. When those assets go up and down, and all of a sudden our net worth's going up and down by $5 or $10 million a year, that, if you can't read a financial statement very well, that scares the death out of you. Mm-hmm. Truly, it does, right?
And causes you to make decisions based on something that isn't
and
necessary.
I think there is a way around what you're saying. That probably there's a way of reanalyzing our liabilities on the OPM, or whatever you call that darn thing. Get it down to where it's reasonable, factor it in, and disclose. Ultimately, is probably the best answer.
One of the actuary that we hired. This is what I'd like to suggest, so we could, if we want, move on. The actuary that we hired is extremely, extremely good, and he has done a lot of work with local governments in terms of helping people understand the impact of OPEB and understand some of the ways in which you can mitigate that impact, and things that you can do like trust funds or other approaches that will help you to solve it. So what I'd like to suggest, and when I hired him, I talked to him about this, I would love to have him come to a Finance Commission meeting, because he's way more knowledgeable on this than me, and have this conversation with you guys. Talk about OPEB, its impact on our books, and things other people have done, and how he feels about the pronouncements. And I think that would be a really useful conversation.
I do.
Cindy, you mentioned there are tactics for mitigating the liability for this as you go forward, changing strategies. But how much of that is contractual? Is there any contractual element to this where you could not?
That's a
Are you saying that what is best practice, so to speak, or what is accounting rules?
I understand your question.
Obligation you cannot get out of.
I understand your question, and there's some question about that. Again, I'd love to have Mr. Rizzo come and talk with you. From what I've seen, there has been in practice a vast difference in what's considered a contractual obligation when it comes to a pension versus what's considered that contractual obligation in the future when it comes to health insurance. And so, and particularly in light of the Affordable Health Care Act, I mean, things are changing. So I would love to make this a whole topic.
Basically, you have retirees who hit an age where they can get Medicare or whatever.
Supplement
some of those costs are not that
Exactly.
Great, and they're on
those costs
Medicare
right now
B anyway.
You are absolutely correct. And those costs right now are for the supplement D are 1/3 of what it is for the city health insurance plan. So there's a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of things that we can do to solve our own problem. And it's kind of, in my mind, not the same as pensions. But if it's good with you, I would love to invite him to come and let's make this a whole topic of a meeting. I'll get you the expert and
Mr. Chairman,
I think we'd all agree with that.
if I may, just for a moment, I remember when the accounting structure started to change and they brought in this picture of unfunded liabilities. And what Cindy said is exactly true, that the big concern was that every governmental entity in the state and in the country probably would be bankrupt if they had to put that out there on their books. That doesn't negate the fact that the liability is there. And what I was going to ask Cindy, and I think you answered part of it, on page 94, when we look at the general employee pension and the funded ratio is 62%, that's how much we have funded toward their liability, which means that about 38% is unfunded. And one of my questions was going to be, in this negotiations, because a lot of these are through contracts with unions and so forth and so on. And sometimes you have to take a little tougher stand than maybe we have in the past, because as you know, the reason we're in a lot of the issues we're in is because Florida has always lived on growth. And growth has stopped and slowed down and actually gone backwards in a few places. So I guess my question to you is, how do you see, with negotiations and contracts and whittling away at that 38% in a reasonable fashion that's doable?
right now, the Jim can stop me if I say anything I'm not supposed to say, given that we're still negotiating. But right now, the offer that the city has placed on the table for the unions throughout these last sets of negotiations is a full stop freeze of the defined benefit plan, meaning on an effective date to be determined, there will be no more growth in the city's liability for any employee in the plan. So therefore, what would happen is that 61 million, let's say, or I'm sorry, the accrued liability of 97.9 would no longer grow. And as a result, from that point forward, all of our efforts would be geared toward reducing the unfunded portion until our remaining liability was fully funded. We would continue to have to make payments toward the unfunded liability, but we would no longer have any normal contributions because that plan would simply cease. And anything people were owed at that point in time, they would still be owed, but no more growth.
Well, what about retirement plans? I know you're restricted to a good bit on some of those. Any opportunities to increase the number of years of retirement in some areas? I think some retire at 20 years. Is that correct?
Well, no. Again, what we would do to replace it would be a defined contribution plan, which, as you know, operates entirely differently. The age at which you can take it out is governed completely by whether you're willing to, take a tax hit or not, et cetera. But the day we freeze the plan, what we cannot do is retroactively change what's already there.
I understand that.
So essentially, what would happen is on the day the plan freezes, you would get, your multiplier times your year of service. The highest salary that you would credit it toward would be in your past. It doesn't matter what you make from now on. It would, that day, that would be the end. We would be able to determine what we owed each and every person in the plan, and that liability would never grow.
So you'll get away from the highest 5, highest 6, whatever.
You'll still have the highest 5, but they'll all be in your past. In other words, no matter how much longer you work for the city, even if it gets better, what your retirement benefits will be calculated on will be your highest 5 as of your freeze date.
I was just curious for a little update on where you were moving with that. Thank you.
That's essentially
Thank you,
the
Mr.
offer.
Chairman.
Now, we're still negotiating, and that has not been accepted by our unions, and so we're not there yet, but that is the city's intention at this point in time, to completely stop the growth of the liability and fill the gap, continue to fill the gap with funding.
I'm not sure you can actually say that liability will not change, because doesn't that have some factor in there about the growth of the assets? And if your assets in the plan didn't grow at that expected rate, then that liability could increase?
The liability wouldn't change because the only way the liability could change is if for instance, if the actuarial tables that say people will perish at a certain age are not proven out. The liability part of it includes assumptions about mortality. The thing that that's affected by the growth is how much we kind of assume that the assets are going to grow to meet the liability.
Oh, it's how much you have to contribute versus
right.
what the liability
So the contribution,
is.
that's what hits out there. The liability would stop,
Out of your pocket.
and the liability would change if our actuarial assumptions, including mortality rates, are bad. But otherwise, it would stay right there.
But it could have more of an impact on the cash required to actually fund it.
It will, and
It just shows up on the balance sheet as a number,
Right.
the real money going out.
Right. Because, as our actuary pointed out, once you freeze the plan,
Go to conservative investments.
yes, some of the assumptions you've made about the growth of your assets have to change as well. So, yeah.
Isn't it also true, Cindy, that if the sale had gone through, if the sale goes through the utilities, the general employee liabilities, pension fund liabilities are reduced by a fairly significant amount.
The idea was,
About
And
one-third.
thereby the percentage gain to the remaining assets is pretty significant.
yeah, the council's intention all along, and for the last couple of years, with the sale proceeds from the electric utility, was to use it to fill this $36 million gap. Not 100%, because you don't want to end up 110% funded, because you cannot get your money back out once you put
Right.
it in. But to bring this up to over 90% and therefore kind of eliminate the problem in one fell swoop. So yeah, that was a huge part of the plan for the proceeds.
But even outside of using the pension funds, the fact that we lose the employees while retaining the asset structure,
That was going to help by $14 million
that's
straight up.
$14 million right there. Now, you probably don't recall, but yeah, so that's a plus right there.
Yeah, that was a huge component of the sale.
At least on the general employee side.
Yeah, they were going to take the liability for the pension for the in electric utility employees, but not take any of our assets away. And so that would have actually solved about $14 million worth of the unfunded gap, just like that,
Yeah,
with
just
the
like
liabilities
that.
gone and the assets remaining. So, yeah, that was a huge component of our plan for dealing with that. All right, so I will take a action to get our OPEB expert here, the guy that did the actuarial evaluation, and we'll have some more lively discussion about OPEB. The third item, this is just a side load. The rest of these are very quick. On page 90, I know we've talked about this in the past, about the FEMA appeal. I just want to point out that it's like a War and Peace novel. The saga continues. The city has made its second appeal. We have worked out all our insurance issues. We've received another very large chunk of money from FMIT that was given to the state on our behalf to solve the question insurance cost. And essentially, at this point, the city in its second appeal maintains that we do not owe FEMA anything. And now we're just waiting for the wheels of FEMA to grind slowly on our appeal. And probably in another year or so, we'll hear from them again.
We haven't, that's about $2 million. We haven't reserved for that or anything, have we?
Well, some of it's reserved in a couple of the enterprise funds. I think there's $500,000 in one of them. But again, I guess from our perspective, we do not owe them this money. And a huge part of the gap was filled by the extra, I think it was $1.8 million that the league gave to them on our behalf after the league resolved its insurance issues. I can't say enough nice things about the way the Florida League of Cities and FMIT stepped up to their responsibility, and 6 years after the hurricane, went back through every single one of those insurance claims, identified the gap between what they had given us and what FEMA gave us, and actually came up with that much more money. They did that for a number of cities in the same situation as us, and they did it for us. They did a lot of hard work, and at the end, they wrote a big check. And so that's kind of unusual for an insurer to do that for you
Yeah, that's a
6
big
years
check,
later.
yeah.
So that was a huge help. So anyway, we hope we'll get past that one fairly easily. Page 105. One of the things we've talked about a lot in the last couple of
Cindy,
years.
I'm sorry, before we go on to that, just to kind of dovetail into what you were saying, in reporting that information to FEMA to get the funding necessary to cover the costs that we've incurred, I'm sure there's a system already in place, and has that met with success with FEMA, or have you had to modify it to capture all the costs? Because I know how particular they are about dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
The bulk of our issue with the FEMA appeal, with the OIG, actually, the audit, the bulk of it was about insurance. They had, let's say, for instance, they had given us based on our submitted expenditures, $400,000 in FEMA money because we got $100,000 in insurance. Then they came back after the fact and said, hey, we think you should have gotten $200,000 in insurance, and we're going to deobligate $100,000. So a lot of it was really about where the city wasn't stuck in the gap. It was either FEMA owed it to us or the insurance company did, because we'd already proved that we spent the money.
Okay, so it wasn't a documentation issue.
It wasn't. Most of it. Now, there were a couple of them that were a documentation issue. We have, in our second appeal, provided them with, we did it on a disc, because if we'd given them the hard copies, they would have had boxes about that deep of the documentation, vendor invoices, calculator tapes, pictures, the whole thing. So, but that was a real small part of it. There may be $300,000 that was in dispute over documentation, but the bulk of it was the insurance thing. Who really owed the money to who, kind of thing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years in budgetary compliance and really moving toward good, realistic budget estimates, and then quarterly meetings where we looked at how we were performing against the budget and variance analyses, and you all know this because we've talked about this a lot. I wanted to point out on 105 what I consider to be the direct result of all that. This is the general fund revenues and expenditures original budget, the one we adopted before the year even started, the amended budget, the one we came up with at the end of the year after we saw what was really going to happen, and then actual expenditures. And at the bottom of 105, you see total expenditures. Our original budget in the general fund for total expenditures was $17.9 million. Our amended final budget was actually slightly lower than that, 17.8. And our real audited expenditures for the fiscal year were 17.3. So not only did we come in under our original budget with our amended, we came in under our amended with our actual expenditures. This is hugely about real estimating and budgetary controls. On the flip side, if you look over at page 102, there was very little difference between our original revenue budget and our final revenue budget, 13.113, 13.112, and our actual revenues, 13.102, only a 10K difference. And again, back, I think a few years ago, we had huge estimates of things like, miscellaneous revenues and interest and stuff like that maybe wasn't real. So again, I think both of these things really reflect a lot of progress on the part of the city and the Finance Commission's help in budgetary controls. The last thing, a hugely overlooked section of the CAFR that starts on page 127. And maybe I only point it out because it's a big pain to put together, but and nobody cares about it, but you should. This is the statistical section. It's full of great information. This includes a 10-year history of property tax rates, a list of who the city's principal taxpayers are by dollars. There's a page in here that shows the city's progress in debt, 2 or 3 pages, and how much it has in its enterprise funds in debt and what its debt coverage is. There's a list of the principal utility ratepayers, a list of all the top 10 customers in our electric utility, the top 10 customers in our water and sewer utility. So as you think about rate changes, you can see who's really going to be impacted, what kind of bills someone like Piper or Waldo's pays every year when it comes to water and sewer or electricity. And there's a really great one here, for instance, on page, there's a full-time equivalent by department, 10-year history. Help me find this. On page 150, that shows the city's staffing by department since 2004. And if you look to the far right there, in 2004, including the enterprise funds, 541 employees. In 2013, 425 employees, and the budgeted number of employees for 13-14 was 403. In the general fund in particular, back to those things we were talking about earlier, 274 in 2004, 201 in 2013, and the budgeted number for fiscal 13-14 is 187 employees. So I know there's been a lot of talk over the years about whether we've really, had any downturn in staffing. I think these numbers kind of speak for themselves. I think the city has really rolled up its sleeves, particularly in the past few years, and pared down staffing levels and focused on service delivery and on what people want the most. And that's a that's a pretty big reduction in a relatively short period of time. So, but anyway, this whole section's full of great stuff like that. So I just pointed out because once in a while people call and say, "Oh, what's our tax rate look like? What's it been for the last however many years?" The page that shows the 10-year history of tax rates has not just Vero's, but also the counties, the school boards, the rest of them. So there's a lot of great information in that section there. And with that,
can I make a point, please?
Sure.
On staffing. If you look at that, people in benchmarking talked about number of city employees per population. You look at that breakdown and take away the enterprise funds, only look at the number of general fund employees per population, and look at the reduction of the
He's still going.
sorry,
I just want to make a point. One should take some care if you're talking about employee ratio to population, given the anomalies and the scope of all of the services and all of the enterprise funds that the city of Vero Beach has, plus an enormous recreation program. That's among that's
another flyby. So the only other thing I wanted to say about the CAFR is that I appreciate you letting me go on about it at some length. It's certainly something that takes up a huge amount of time and effort in the finance department. We're pretty proud of it, and I want to thank my staff, Javier Gonzalez, my assistant finance director, and all my staff. It's a big undertaking. It's unlike the budget; it happens where nobody really gets to see it. And I certainly want to thank our professional support from Raymond, Margot, and Ross and their team. It's been a successful year, I think. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, but.
No, if you wanted me to take just a few minutes, really, I think Cindy's covered a lot of the items I wanted to. Maybe I'll just take a quick overview of the financial statements just to make you aware, just so you know. These are the comprehensive annual financial report, and I'm sure most everybody's aware that the city voluntarily participates in a program through the Government Finance Officers Association, and I think it's on page 9, you receive a certificate for excellence in financial reporting, which just simply means you volunteer in this program and choose to report at a much higher standard than what the professional standards require you to. So it's just a commitment to quality and excellence that the city has taken on for a number of years and has been continued on with your current finance director as well. So it's something you should be proud of, and that the city takes the responsibility of preparing these CAFRs at that extra high level. With that in mind, I mean, when you the standards just really require general purpose financial statements, but you have really 4 sections here: an introductory section, the financial section, the statistical section, and then a compliance section. For the most part, our audit encompasses the financial section and the compliance section of the audit. I had a couple of things just to point out. Cindy already covered really a lot of things I wanted to. Again, on page 9, you have that certificate that you received for complying with the Government Finance Officers Association's Excellence in Financial Reporting Program. This was for 2012. Obviously, have submitted the 2013 CAFR and certainly expect to receive the award again going forward. I don't know the percentage. It's not a large percentage of municipalities throughout the United States to participate in the program. Cindy, do you know? I just 20% or?
I think a lot of the smaller governments tend not to, just because
Right.
they don't have the staff or the resources to prepare it to this level. So
Right. So just something to let you know that your city continues to, take the responsibility of compiling financial information seriously. Our opinion is on page 13, and for those of you who enjoyed this kind of stuff, this is a new opinion. We went through these clarity standards, and the idea was to better define the responsibilities in the audit report. So you'll see it starts off, it talks about the report on the financial statements, management's responsibilities, the internal auditor's responsibility, then our opinion, and then in some other matters. The bottom line, even though it's a new format, and I think it lays out a little better the understanding of everybody's responsibility, we still issue a clean opinion, highest level of assurance that we can as auditors, and in our opinion, the financial statements are fairly presented. Another item on page 17 is this management's discussion and analysis page, and on there is a nice 7, 8, 10 pages of a high-level discussion about the city's activity for the past fiscal year. So it's a nice place to go, sort of the State of the Union address right there, located on page 17. Gives you a quick overview of some ratios, some changes, and analysis, and also let you know what's happening within the city. So page 17 is just a real nice summary. Get through the financial statements again. I'm not going to spend time to go through every one of these in detail. On page 31, maybe just to kind of emphasize the point a little bit on the issue you were discussing with the enterprise funds. If you look at page 31, I mean, this really sort of highlights what you're talking about, and I understand the part about the capital assets, but when you look at this, you look at the primary government, you see the expenditures, you see the charges for services, these other program revenues. And then you come over here to the far right-hand column and you see net expenses and revenue. And as you would totally expect, the first part of that, the total government activities, is a negative $19 million. Well, just as we were talking about, those are the activities that the government chooses to provide to its citizens. And when you flip the page, you start off with a $19 million deficit. Okay, where are we going to get those dollars? And so property taxes, sales tax, utility tax, and so on. The other part of this on page 31 is then the enterprise funds, that last part there, the government type funds. And as you go through, you see the electric funds, there again is the expenditures, the charges, and when you get to the far right-hand side, you see $6 million profit, water, $2 million profit. But when you get all the way to the bottom, you see the revenue, the recreation fund there at a deficit of $1,900,000. So I just emphasize the discussion that you had earlier.
It needs to be up in that top part.
Yeah, right. By the way, with the angels flying over, the only thing I thought of as I was driving in today was how beautiful the skies were and how much beautiful weather we've had. I think we're going to lose them in the sky. I mean, the color of the planes and the blue sky. I was like, we're not going to be able to see them this weekend. It's been so spectacular the last week. A couple of items in the footnotes. Cindy went through really all the pension items. I wanted to point out on page, I have it marked here, a change that we had on page 77. And we noted this as an extraordinary item, so I just thought it'd be worth mentioning to you. In your internal service funds, when you're accruing for claims, liability insurance, and all of that, as the footnote says on page 77 there, back in 2002, there was an accident, there was a person that was injured, and the city had a responsibility to pay health costs for that individual. So there was a liability that was incurred, it was funded, and money was put into your internal service fund. Unfortunately, the individual passed away, and therefore that funding, that liability went away as well. So when we talk about this extraordinary activity, there's $1,400,000 really of a liability that was decreased in your internal service funds. So I wanted to point that out. And then I was going to talk about the pensions. Cindy did a great job going through all of that. The last kind of section then for us is all the way towards the back, which is the compliance section, starting on page 157. And contained back there is the city receives grant monies. And primarily, virtually all of it, I think you had about $1.5 million, and virtually all of that, but maybe a couple $100,000 was related to the airport. So virtually all of it was airport-related dollars. Because you have those grant dollars, it falls under the federal single audit, which puts the responsibility on us, the auditors, to test the compliance of that grant. It's a little different work than us just doing financial audits. I mean, we have to review, understand the grants, test the expenditures of those grant dollars, and make sure that you've complied with all of the grant requirements. And everything contained in this section back here basically says that we've tested it, here's what you spent the money on, and everything's in compliance. So there's nothing that we found that would require us to report to you or to the city that the city, the finance, did properly account for and expend those grant dollars during this fiscal year. And really, that was it. That was just my quick overview of the financial statements in particular. I'm happy to answer any specific questions you might have, and also offer to you, as I do all the time, and to all the council members, if anybody would like to meet with me one-on-one, I'm always happy to make myself available and be glad to answer any questions you might have. We're here in Indian River County, so we're easily accessible. So if there's any specific questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
I wonder, just looking at this, some of it's very difficult for me to sort of put in context, and I wonder if we've ever thought about doing a sort of a 10-year plan or something like that of income and expense and then balance sheet. Then you can do some what-ifs and things and understand what some of these things mean over a period of time. I mean, some of it's really hard to get your hands around. Yeah,
I'll let Cindy address that. I know there's some projections, but I'll let her talk to that.
In the context of the CAFR, we can't do forward-looking projections because there's no way for them to audit those. They're not auditable. Yeah. But certainly on some of the funds like the cemetery, where we've had issues, we've done 10-year pro formas, projections going forward to what revenue and expense increases might look like, and then with like the electric and the water sewer utility, there are, and I can show them to you, a number of places where there have been, in the context of optimization studies and things like that, some multi-year, ongoing projections. The last rate sufficiency analysis we had done by an outside contractor for the electric utility had a 10-year projection. So, I mean, there is some of that for the various enterprise funds. As far as the general fund goes, that's a little harder because you're making assumptions about what future councils might consider a priority in terms of public services. So, so we have where it makes sense, and I'll be happy to share some of those with you.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. This pertains to the oil in tank number 2. How old is that oil that's sitting in there currently?
It's all gone. But it ended up being, this was written right when the contract started, and because it was big enough, we had to include it as an extraordinary item. Council actually approved the final payment to the contractor who removed it at their meeting the other day. Bottom line, the loss wasn't quite as bad as we thought. It started out valued on our books at about $1.2 million. When the contractor began removing it, even though, and I don't know if Tom's here yet, he can speak to it, but even though as they got closer to the bottom, they expected it to degrade, we ended up getting more money than we thought. So the loss was really only about $400,000 total between what we lost on the fuel and what we paid to remove the sludge.
Okay, but I guess where I'm getting at, prior to it being pulled out, how long was it sitting there?
Wow.
Approximately?
Your guess? 10 years or more.
Okay, so clearly oil 10 years ago isn't at the rate of what it is today. So was it really a loss, or did we buy it at $2 a gallon and we sold it for $4 a gallon? That's what I'm getting at.
It was valued on the books at around, if I want to, 3-something, I believe. But, I mean, these guys can speak to that a little bit. You don't, I mean, in governmental accounting, you don't necessarily go in and adjust assets like that to market value every year. You don't do it with land, and you don't necessarily do it with things like that are on the books. So, I mean, it's only a loss, like, on paper, because that's what the audited inventory was last year. In reality, what we have is $800,000 in unrestricted cash that we didn't have before, and a liability that was worth really nothing to us in practical terms. That's been off the books.
Okay.
But I can't get rid of it. If it was valued at $1.2 million at the end of the fiscal year, I can't.
Right, but
I have to put that somewhere. Yeah.
If it's valued at $1.2 million, but 10 years ago we only paid $300,000 for the fuel, right there we're in a positive $900,000, and then you take away the $300,000 that they charge us to pump it out. So really, it's a $600,000.
But it's come and gone over the years. It wasn't filled up 10 years ago and sat there for 10 years. I mean, we value it at cost.
That's my mistake then.
When fuel deliveries have been made and been placed into the tank.
Okay, I thought we just transferred to natural gas or something, and it's been sitting there.
No. There's a running. There's actually a sheet every month that shows.
I gotcha.
They dip it. It shows usage. It shows how much has been delivered and the cost of the deliveries.
That clarifies.
That establishes the per barrel price. Yeah, I'm sorry,
you.
I misunderstood the question. So yeah.
The certificate from the GFOA, does that help with the bond rating?
I would say indirectly, only because it means that your financial statements are a little more thorough. I know that Fitch and Moody's both rely on these when they do their periodic rating updates on us. And I imagine if you just had flat financial statements. The other thing is I'm required every year by the covenants of one of our bonds to use, to do bond reporting through, and their name is going to escape me right now. There's a website where we have to put out operating indicators and financial information. If I didn't have this kind of a CAFR, we would have a whole separate disclosure requirement with them. It's an SEC disclosure. And so instead, we're able to just upload this CAFR and we're good to go, and we fill in a couple of other blanks and we're done because it meets the standard of that disclosure.
I would say, too, I don't think there's a direct correlation, but the municipalities that participate in the program are probably a little more sophisticated. Therefore, the governmental entities are probably a little better run. People understand the financial accounting, so therefore, the financial stability of that municipality, and certainly the case with the city of Vero Beach, is probably a little stronger just because of the strength of the finance department and then the interaction with the finance commission and the city itself. So I don't think there's a direct correlation other than the people who participate are excited about this because they want to produce the best product they can.
Do the auditors tell the GFOA that they met the standards, or is
No.
there a committee at GFOA
that's a good.
that reviews
Right.
Committee at
Yeah, that's a
GFOA.
great question. In fact, we serve on the GFOA review committee, not for the cities, but for the city of Vero Beach in particular. So this is submitted to the government finance, a nationwide organization. It goes out, they review it, and then they'll send it out to 2 or 3 other participating CPAs who will go through a review checklist. It's a pretty thorough process, and then they accumulate all of the information. There's always some comments here or there, enhance this, improve that, and then ultimately, based on making sure that once you get the feedback from all the people who have participated in the program, as long as there's no significant deficiencies, then they award the certificate. So it's a pretty comprehensive program and involves probably 3 or 4 CPAs throughout the nation, and then the organization itself. Yep.
And there are always comments, but as long as they don't rise, in the opinion of the reviewers, to the level of an actual deficiency, you will still get the award, but you will get those suggestions for improvement. Many times those suggestions for improvement or comments say, and if this is not corrected, then, next year we're not going to be okay with it. So it's a process that's helpful to us, too, because every year it helps us to whip these into better shape. So,
Just a quick question on the, on the report itself. Your findings and comments, is that part of page 19, management discussion, or recommendations even?
Well, if you're referring to, we do issue, there's a couple of different letters here. Maybe can you tell me exactly which paragraph, or just our findings in particular?
No, just in particular. No, there's nothing in particular. It's just in general, your findings, comments, and recommendations.
Right, and we have no specific management comments and recommendations for improving the internal controls.
Okay.
We everything is functioning properly. Of course, we meet with your city manager and the finance director,
Sure.
But there is a management letter, probably what you're referring to, all the way to the back, and this in particular addresses certain Florida statutes that we're also required to test and report on. Had we had some deficiencies or reportable conditions on your internal controls, we would report those on page, starting on page 171. So everything.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so everything that's included on page 171 are really the required language that the Auditor General with the state of Florida requires us, but we have no additional comments that we would bring before you that would be a material weakness, an internal control deficiency in the operations of the accounting system.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Sure. Really, the last thought I had, just real quick, I just want to make sure, one thing as auditors, what we always look at is what we call tone at the top. We meet with your city manager and your finance director several times during the audit process. This audit takes us, I think, about 750 hours. So we come and we take up some residency for a period of time and, establish legal residency here at the county or at the city. But the issue about tone at the top is to make sure things are done right. They want them done right. If there's issues that come up that, bring them to your city manager in particular, as well as your finance director, that we bring those those issues to their attention and to make sure that they're addressed properly as well. And I can just say that we've always found that tone at the top is excellent. I mean, it's always let us know, what can we do better, how do we enhance this, how do we make it better. So as an audit firm, that's one of the first things we look at is the tone at the top, and I think it's excellent here at the city. So again, thank you all, and again, please, anytime if you have any questions, you feel free to give me a call. I'll be happy to talk to you or meet with you directly.
Raise one quick question.
Sure.
Maybe it's just clarification. I'm not sure. On page 89, right? We talk about contract commitments. Okay. The third line down, it says, "City has no equity interest in any of the assets owned by FMPA." Then it goes down to the last sentence, and it says, again, it reiterates, "City has no equity interest in any plant owned by FMPA, and is only contractually obligated for participation in the acquisition." I'm not sure. I hear things bannered around town, and I'm not sure. What does that mean, Jim? What does that mean? I mean, do we own assets or don't we own assets?
This issue came up several years ago, even before the city was talking about any sale with the power plant or anything like that. The point to that is, I mean, you have no ownership in the assets through FMPA. You have contractual obligations, you have contractual commitments you have to make, but you have no ownership in the fixed assets themselves.
But we own participation, so is that what we're showing on our balance sheet? We got the liability.
Well, right. And
so
what City
the
says
offset is what? A participation
We don't
agreement?
have the liability on our we don't have a liability on our balance sheets either.
Well, we got bond liabilities.
We have our own bond liabilities. But we have our own bonds on our balance sheet, but we don't have any of their assets.
So what's offsetting
then
that? I mean,
we don't have any of their bond liabilities on our balance sheet either. All we have on our balance sheet is our actual loans to the city of Vero Beach.
Related to our plant.
Related to our plant, our loans that we pay our debt service on. We do not have any of their liabilities.
So in a sense, all we have is a sort of a cash flow participation issue on our balance. It's not even on our balance sheet.
Nope, it's not
It's
on
in
our
our
balance
operating statements. That's all.
That's
right?
it.
So it's like a lease. I mean, it's like we're leasing
right.
a piece of the deal.
Exactly right. That point there is to say that you're not consolidating in, you're not bringing in the assets and liabilities. Right. That's exactly correct. So it is really, other than your just contractual obligation, it's just operating expenses.
It's just a darn lease. You hear it bannered around town, this and that, and you say, wait a minute. Looks like a lease.
But to carry that forward, we have the city of Vero Beach has a contractual liability with FMPA and the power contracts that FMPA has and administers. I think I'm right on that.
That is correct. We have,
right.
So
using a lease, I think, is a very appropriate way of doing it.
Right.
So
we are leasing through FMPA through their contractual ownership of plants. And so when you hear bannered around that we have 1.5% ownership, it's really a leasing agreement. In St. Lucie, I think, is the one that usually comes up. We have an obligation for that. Under our terms of our conditions of our contractual agreement, we are actually paying for the operation of those plants, but I think it is just a contractual agreement. And so that's where FMPA is holding on to, and as you know in our latest discussion, that our contracts are for the life of the plant or the term of the bonds, whichever is greater.
It feels like an oil well to me. You're buying a piece of an oil well.
Except you're making money with an oil well.
Right, I know. But even if you don't, sometimes you pay it. Right?
Those intangible drilling rights.
It's intangible drilling right. That's what it feels like, the touch of it.
You make a good point, though.
Dan?
I think in the context of the CAFR, though.
What's that?
In the context of the CAFR, what's important, and you make a good point, is none of FMPA's assets, liabilities, or anything are represented on the city's electric utility balance sheets. They do not exist in our financial statements in that way because that's not the structure of our relationship with them. So their liabilities aren't here, their assets aren't here. This is purely the city's liabilities and the city's direct assets.
But on a funding basis, if the funds would come the way they're supposedly, that does wipe out our bonds, theoretically.
Well, that would be because we had cash.
We're using the money.
Yeah. And again, and this kind of plays back to something that I've given out a couple of times. There's been a lot of talk about what's our net proceeds from the sale.
Right.
The sheet that I've done and that I've given to, I think, many of you on a couple of occasions, only shows direct cash in and outflows to the city of Vero Beach. It's what it will look like on our books if it happens,
Right.
and when it happens. But all these other, well, so-and-so is this to that, and they have nothing to do with the city's books. And so, we'll get cash in, we'll owe cash out for debt service, we'll give cash back to our customers for their deposits, we'll have cash coming in from receivables. That's all that I show on the sheet where I show the inflows and outflows from the sale, because that's the only thing that will show in our CAFR in the year when we sell that electric utility.
Well, the only reason I bring this up is because you hear it bannered around town. And when you start reading it in the auditor's statement, who has apparently reviewed some legal documents, this is pretty clear. So you can argue about it. Some people around town are banning about. Well, that seems to...
Well, on that same note, just to clarify, on the liability issue, when the plant does run its life and needs to be shut down, we're not liable for any of the shutdown costs?
Yes, we are. That's part of the operation of the plant itself, just like it is today. If something should go haywire in one of the plants, we have an obligation to be paying into that operation and maintenance of the facility.
Okay, so God forbid there was a nuclear accident, we would be partially liable for that.
As a matter of fact, that's part of our debate right now on the contingent liability. FMPA's position is, and from the contracts, the way they're written, yes, we do for the life of the plant, and the life of the plant includes the decommissioning of a plant.
It's just like shutting down an oil well. Oil well can shut down, but you still get a bill for putting the concrete in it.
Yeah. A fine example, FMPA is part of the Crystal River 2 plant. Okay, and that's being decommissioned and ultimately will be cleaned up. But nobody knows if it's going to be 30 years or 50 years, but it's built into the rate structure that we receive, or we don't because we're not part of that, but other cities are built into their rate structure to pay for that cost as obligated by FMPA.
And hopefully they're reserving for all those things, and right. Hopefully.
Well, and the Crystal River plant was too young to really have enough reserve for that. They did reserve because i.e. the utility is required to do that. But they bill that to FMPA as part of that reserve. And then FMPA, on the other hand, bills it out to the member cities who are tied into contractually into through the contracts to those particular plants. In our case, the 3 plants that we have that we buy power from based on the power generators, Stanton 2 and St. Lucie plant. Now, theoretically, or in practicality, FMPA does buy power from other plants when, for example, Stanton plant is off, but we still have contractual agreements that we will pay for that downtime of the Stanton plant, using that as an example. The example I like to use is we have a responsibility for a position, for example, the control room operator. We're paying part of his cost under our contract.
If FMPA were to sell a plant, would we participate in any proceeds? Or?
FMPA, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way FMPA does things, they never write you a check. It's reflected in their utility bills. So it's not like we're going to get a check. Take the Taylor swaps as an example. The Taylor swaps could turn out to be a positive number depending on the fluctuation of the interest rates. And they could take and use those swaps to fund another facility of theirs to do it. And if there is a positive proceed, then they build that into their rate structures going to the other utilities. And FMPA, the way their rate structures are developed, they have different components depending on what city is in what program. For example, some of the smaller cities actually pay a fraction of a cost in their utility rate for training. We don't choose to do that, but some of the smaller cities do, and they will have lineman training and that type of stuff. And so their rate structure or their rates are different than ours.
And FMPA is audited, so any proceeds they get have to be reflected in their rates to us?
Yes, ma'am. They have an annual audit that has to go over all the programs that they and all their activities.
You can find their annual audit reports, their CAFRs, online at their website. I've seen them.
Could I raise one more question? I know I'm just raising questions today. But okay. Again, on page 90, okay, first paragraph, okay. It's the first sentence is talking about the all requirement project. Then it moves down and it talks about the Orlando Utilities Commission. I clearly understood this too. Those two made sense to me. When I get down to the final sentence, this is where it's a little confusing. The city is currently negotiating a release from this contract. Now, the previous sentence is talking about Orlando. And it's saying the contract with FMPA. Is that a misnomer in a sentence? I mean, is that sentence referring to Orlando, or is it referring to FMPA?
Actually, it's referring to both, because we have contractual agreements with both.
No, we do.
Okay, with FMPA, it's the take-or-pay base load that we have, and they're tied to both
Right.
Stanton plants and the St. Lucie. Then we have our capacity cost with OUC that we also have to terminate that contract in order to make the sale of our system. Under that term, and again, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but under that term, what we're doing is buying capacity that OUC is obligated to provide for us, and I think it's 93 megawatts this year. But we've got to go and terminate that, as well as the FMPA contract. So you have, both entities have to be addressed in our transaction.
So it's not referring to just one, it's referring to both contracts are being negotiated in tandem, I guess, because they all affect each other.
Correct.
And they both involve the FMPA.
And somewhere along the line, they do involve FMPA. And somewhere along the line, we chose to get our allocations from those specific plants with FMPA.
Right.
Under the OUC contract, we said, we don't care where you get it, you owe us 93 megawatts if we need 93 megawatts, using that one example. And under those terms, they are required if our capacity is there. Now, we pay a premium for that. We pay OUC right at $1 million a month to have that capacity in reserve for us. And then that capacity factor changes on an annual basis depending on what our historical and what they are projecting as our future needs will be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I was just trying to clarify so I understood the
Yeah, so there's really two contracts that we have to exit it.
paragraph's talking about. Mm-hmm. Okay. Any further questions from the group? Good. Cindy, you want to move to selection of audit committee?
I do, and I'll go ahead and let these guys go so they don't have to be there.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were very helpful.
Probably another good segue. Back in October of last year, the City Council approved us renewing our engagement with Raymond on the condition that we go out this summer with an RFP for audit services for the year that ends September 30th, 2014. So essentially, we have to have an auditor in place by October the 1st of 2014 based on a formal selection process. Unlike your typical RFP, there are very specific requirements in Florida statutes for how you go about selecting an auditor. And one of the very first things that has to happen is the council has to establish a special audit committee made up of people who will then conduct the auditor selection process. This memo actually went to council at their meeting on May the, I don't know what it says here, May the 6th, April the 15th. Thank you. And what they agreed to at staff's suggestion was that the audit committee should be made up of members of the Finance Commission. However, if you look at even the GFOA guidance for audit committees, here's the way they put it. An audit committee should have sufficient members for meaningful discussion and deliberation, but not so many as to impede its efficient operation. As a general rule, the minimum membership of the committee should be no fewer than 3. And so council agreed that no fewer than 3 of Finance Commission members should make up that audit committee. The reason I made it so it didn't have to be all of you is I will admit to you, it'll be some extra work over the summer. Essentially, you'll have to have one meeting where you look at the draft RFP, which we'll prepare for you, and make any changes to it that you want before it gets released. You'll get however many proposals that we have come in for you to read and evaluate. You'll have one fairly long meeting with the committee to discuss your evaluation of those proposals. Likely another meeting where you take the top 3 ranked firms and hear oral presentations from them and make a final ranking and recommendation. So you're talking a lot of homework and at least 3 more meetings here throughout the summer. The schedule, my proposed schedule of those activities is attached so that you could see what parts of it would involve you if you're on the committee, because we have to have someone in place before October the 1st, because that's when we kick into gear for that 7 months, 750 hours worth of work that has to happen before March. So the council asked you to choose among yourselves and pick 3 of your members. I would suggest it would be really good, and I know there are a couple of specific members on the commission who have some exposure to CAFRs and the preparation of CAFRs and audits and these kinds of financial audits. It would really be good to have, I'm not rolling anybody under the bus, but one or more of you on that committee, just because this is a fairly important selection. So with that, I turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may ask, how many raise their hands have a financial background?
I do.
Well, okay, that's good. Oh, don't forget you. Okay.
I know
See, I didn't do that, Scott did.
I'm a contractor. I understand it, but I'm certainly by no means an accountant or anything. Absolutely.
I don't, mean to sound daunting with the work. I mean, clearly, it's going to be a couple extra meetings if you can commit to that. But, and I can't tell you how many proposals we'll get, but that's.
I've served on several of them, and I suspect I've gone through maybe, I don't know, three of them or something like that. Not this way, but they take a little time. You usually end up with about 5 or 6 to review. The reviews take a little time, and the grading is a little grayer than you would think sometimes. But the staff is always good to work with, so it happens pretty rapidly. You don't procrastinate in committees. I can tell you that. That's my experience. Can I find a volunteer around here?
Yeah, you'll have full staff support. We'll run the meetings.
I'll be glad to volunteer.
Materials and
Now, can Mr. Ohl serve?
yes, this is completely separate than the Finance Commission.
Okay.
So any 3
You've got experience, Mr.
members that
Right?
you want to suggest, if council approves them, then that will be the Audit Committee.
Can
It's
you
a special
handle it?
purpose committee that will
So
be
there's
for this
2.
one reason and then dissolve.
Aren't you an accountant?
I've done.
She's done
You wanna
audits.
do this?
I was staring at her, but then Scott made her raise her hand, so that pretty much cemented it for us.
What's that?
Okay.
So I have 3.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Cindy, with 3 members on the committee and being a part of the Finance Commission, we'll have to, if we meet together, we'll have to advertise those meetings, correct, for the Sunshine?
You will get full staff support. Our purchasing department advertises those meetings, prepares agendas. You'll do them in this
Okay, but
room.
it'll be an open forum, just like this.
Open forum
Okay,
that the
thank you.
law requires, particularly for auditor selection,
Yeah.
that it be conducted in the Sunshine.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
But I don't think they get together to discuss it. They're individual reviews. Is that correct, Cindy?
It'll be just like the ones that you've done. We'll have a meeting scheduled in this room,
Right,
fully
public,
advertised,
yeah.
where everyone comes together to discuss amongst themselves in the Sunshine their evaluation.
But outside of that public meeting, they don't get together.
Cannot be done.
That's right.
The good news is that the way Florida and the AG have changed their suggested approach over the years is the finance director can no longer be a member of that committee. And so I have no involvement
Right.
in the ranking and recommendation. What it does mean is if you have questions, you are allowed to call and talk to me, because I'm not under the Sunshine Law with regard to that, because I'm not part of the committee.
And we wouldn't be if you were part of the committee.
And if I was part of the committee, you could not. Exactly. The other critical thing, and I know we'll go through all this once the committee starts, is you also absolutely cannot talk to any of the proposers once the RFP goes out. So,
Right.
but other than that, you'll have resources available to you. And we'll take care of all the administrative stuff. You'll just have the job of making some decisions and reviewing proposals.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, you got the names?
I
You
do.
covered?
Mr.
Yes,
Old,
I do.
Ms. Barton, and Mr. Powers. Do you want to make a
Okay.
motion, or is everyone just all good with it? Okay.
Okay.
Moving on. We can.
Excuse me, who are the 3 members?
Oh, I'm sorry. The three members are Mr. Old, Ms. Barton, and Mr. Powers.
Congratulations, guys.
Thank you, Peter.
The next one we
And
can... Oh, I'm sorry. Did you...
Peter, you have something?
No, okay. I'm sorry. Must have been the baby again. You have in front of you your second quarterly financial report and variance analysis. As we did last time, and I hope this is useful, you have the page in there that shows the pooled cash and investments. You have the page on 26 that shows the balance sheet at the end of the second quarter for the electric utility. And probably the good news there is that our total cash is up over $30 million, and our unrestricted cash on hand at the end of this quarter was up to 86 days. So that's an improvement over the first quarter, and one that we expected because the first quarter is when we pay the debt service. This will go back down in the third quarter because, based on your recommendation, Council did approve paying off that one loan for $3 million, so we'll dip back down a little. I don't really see any variances that are alarming or outside the norm, except for positive ones. And so unless you want to spend some time on this, I'm just happy to answer any questions you might have about the report or the variance analysis.
Cindy, I only had one item, and I think, again, my notes are always scrolling. But on electrical fund revenues, that 254 is part of the 380 potential loss on the fuel, correct? That's on page one of page 2.
It is. That's how
Okay,
much
so
was
that-
had
all
been
right.
removed and net of the value as of the end of March. Yeah,
Right.
that's exactly what we were talking about earlier. Yeah. And again, it's a book loss. We didn't lose money, but it
I
has to
understand.
come out as an
I
expense.
understand. It's a yeah, I understand. Balance sheet loss.
Can I follow up? I'm sorry, Glenn, are you finished?
What's that, Peter?
I had a question as well, and that is, I believe there's 827,000 net cash flow from the removal of the fuel. And is that, in fact, included in the data of this report or not? The full amount of 827?
Well, the amount of the we didn't get all of it by March 31st. It will all be in the next quarter. It crossed over into April before the project was actually done because we got progress payments. But the cash itself shows in that balance sheet for the electric utility, yes, as unrestricted cash.
Yeah, I understand, but the total amount is in these reports as of, or is there some carryover of the 827 into the cash flow?
The total amount of the cash that we received as of March 31st is here in these reports, but that contract wasn't done by the end of March, so you will see a little bit more in April. The contract wasn't...
That's
Yes.
my point, and that will flow into the R&R fund, will it not?
No, that is in the operating fund because that's where the asset was.
That had to be inventory on the books at that
It was
point.
inventory on the books, correct.
Yeah.
So if you look, I guess in answer to your question, if you look on page 26 of this report, the amount at the top in assets, unrestricted cash and investments has been adjusted upward to reflect the money we received for this as of the end of March.
Yeah.
And the amount in inventories has gone down to reflect the disposal of the inventory.
Sure.
Is that the answer that you were looking for, Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to know where the cash went.
Yeah, it's
And whether it was all inclusive, and you're saying, no, there's still some incremental amount that's still going to be booked.
yes, in April's. Yeah, so the end of the third quarter, you'll see the full effect of both the increase in the cash and the decrease in the inventory on this balance sheet on 26 by the end of the third quarter.
Exactly. And that was, thank you.
Right. Any other questions?
As always, I'm happy to answer. I mean, if you come up with them later or at some point, just give me a call. I'm always happy to meet and discuss these at more length. I just don't want to take up your time here if you don't want me to.
I'm sorry, I have one follow-up question.
Sure.
That is, and that has to do with, in the electric fund, as we know, the amount of professional funds to the transactional attorneys is running significantly lower than what the 1.02 million was budgeted. Now, we know we've hired another attorney, but in fact, that should, at least some trajectory, go into the rate sufficiency, shouldn't it, with that reduction?
And we're about to move to the rate sufficiency. Yes, to some degree. I think what we talked about when we decided to pay off the loan was that we would not count the payoff of that loan principal against the rate sufficiency either. We'd kind of roll with the punches in the cash flow. And so right now I haven't adjusted the operating costs downward to reflect that coming in under budget, just as maybe a little bit of a hedge against the payment of that debt. So right now, when we move to the electric rate sufficiency, everything except for the projected revenue and the purchase power costs are based on the original adopted budget. And we're only halfway through the year, too. Other things kind of come and go within the budget. But certainly, if we reach the end of the year and it's to our benefit still, despite, anything that might happen this summer, then that will help a little bit with our cash.
But we're way ahead on the legal bills anyway related to the power plant.
Yeah, we are.
At this point in the year.
You mean they're more
At
than
this
what
point.
we thought, or they're less?
Well, they're less in the first part of the year.
Well, remember
I'm not
the
aware.
year before last, we didn't budget enough, and then they were way more than that. So this
Okay.
past year, we budgeted enough, and now we're in a place where they're less than that. So
Yeah, because the city's in limbo. We are not spending a lot of money with legal bills yet. Doesn't mean we won't.
yet is, possibly the operative word, too. So to answer your question, Mr. Chairman, at this point, we're way behind, but I haven't really gone ahead and adjusted the rate sufficiency to reflect that for the current year because there are just a few other things up in the air at this point. When we do the 14-15 budget, hopefully by the time we adopt that, we'll have a better feel for what the real number is for next year. And at that point, it will affect the rates in October.
Correct.
And the point I was going to make, that in fact we were also going to look at a separate meeting to see if there was other opportunities for rate reductions. And I just get the impression that there is a potential, other than what is going to be stated next on the rate sufficiency, there is some potential for yet additional reductions when all the data comes in. And that's speculation, of course.
Possibly, because and if you want to, we can adjust that if we want to move to the rate sufficiency, the quarterly rate sufficiency. Are we done with the budget and variance analysis? Okay, great. That's a good point. So let's look at this rate
Is everybody
sufficiency.
okay with that?
Everyone okay?
We may have lost Peter.
Oh no. He'll be back. Thank you. So bottom line, we'll go straight to the good news, and then we'll talk our way back from there. What you have in front of you is the second quarter electric utility rate sufficiency. We have updated based on actual billed revenues, our revenue through the end of March. We've updated based on actual bills that we've paid to our power suppliers, our purchase power costs through the end of March. And as a result, looking at where that left us at year end, we feel comfortable in suggesting that we can lower the rates and still, at the end of this fiscal year, be ahead by about $900,000, which is a really comfortable, our 1% margin that we like to have because things change, and also is the cost recovery we originally anticipated when we started the year. The decrease would be all in the purchase power costs because that's the reason that our costs are down. We would suggest going from $75 per 1,000 kilowatt hours, which is where the rate is now, to $69.50 per 1,000 kilowatt hours, effective with all the billing reads that begin on June the 1st. And that would be a 4.2% decrease on your typical 1,000 kilowatt hour residential bill. As usual, we would monitor this again at the end of the next quarter, make sure we're still on track. And I don't know if we're going to get him back online. I mean, it kind of speaks to what the chairman was saying. What does that mean in October? When we have this other meeting and we address some of the suggestions for further rate reductions, there's also some potential for some things to increase next year. We have already paid off that debt. We're to the good of $1.1 million there. Maybe we won't need as much money for transactional attorneys. That remains to be seen. That helps. So there may be things like that that could offset any potential we have for rate increases, which Mr. Richards discussed with the Utility Commission. So I guess we feel comfortable with this at this point in time. Certainly it will give some rate relief in the summer months, and we believe it'll leave us in a good spot. And come October, we'll have a whole bunch of other things in the mix to address the rates for next year. So I don't know if Tom wants to speak to the power costs or not. So.
Well, just briefly to echo kind of what Cindy is saying is that the power cost part of this bill, which is what I'm trying to forecast for you, really hasn't changed going forward. In other words, the remaining 6 months on the forecast that I did for the budget still stay the same. There's been not much variation from that except for some small savings here and there. Mm-hmm. So, the changes that we've seen for the first 6 months have been better than the budget, a little bit, not a whole lot, but a little bit. And other cost savings are just coming in with other non-power cost departments. So that's where we are. No big changes.
Yeah. Tom, can you give us an estimate as to the total electric utility budget? How much you can expect that to be reduced over the next 6 months?
If you look at,
I think Cindy has that projected on her sheets here.
Probably the best place to see this is attachment.
Do you see $1 million reduction, a $2 million reduction, or something?
It's about $1.5 million or $2
million. Okay,
in revenue less.
Fine.
Yeah.
Then the last time the Joint Utility and Finance Committee met, and that was either March or early April, whatever. I think they all left with the conclusion that $1 million reduction in the total budget represented about $1 to $1.50 in the monthly utility rate.
It does over a 12-month period.
Over a 12-month period.
But that's a great question. I'm happy for the opportunity to clarify that. $1 million for an entire year, that's about what it would be. We're talking about almost $2 million for only 4 months.
Okay, so we're maybe over that 4-month period, a $2 to $3 reduction in the bill?
We're looking at from $75 to $69.50, so $5.50.
Okay.
Yeah, $5.50. Yeah. So yeah, it is around 1% for $1 million for a year, but when you compress a couple of million down into 3 or 4 months, then it goes up percentage-wise accordingly.
Okay.
Now, how often were we going to evaluate this? I know we discussed it. We didn't want a seesaw motion of looking at it every month or so, but was it every quarter?
Quarterly.
Okay.
Yeah, quarterly. And that's what we did in January.
Okay.
Between the Blue Angels and that noise, it's just I'm very jumpy today. We did it in January and made it effective January, February timeframe. So here we are for June, and we'll look at the next quarter, and then we do it again for next fiscal year. But you're right, Council, and you both commissioners suggested that every month is ridiculous. So we've kind of gone back to let's look at it quarterly, and if the change is significant enough to matter to our customers, then consider changing it. If this were 0.5%, I would suggest to you that it's no point in doing it. But we think it's
Is there any cost associated with either programming the bills or whatever to implement the change?
Just a little bit of staff time. Our system is set up so that the rates are in there in a lookup table. You just go change them to the new ones, and off you go.
All right. That's a win-win.
Mr. Chairman, as I sat and read through this and heard some of the discussion, and that was a good comment about going up and down, we've done rate studies on the water, sewer, and other things, but I don't recall in recent years doing anything with electric. And I'm wondering, and this is just to throw out to the group here, if it might not be time to look seriously at having someone review our rate structure. Used to, we bought fuel and we produced electricity. Now we buy power. And that's a big difference between starting from the ground and working up or just having someone provide the power. So I'm just curious if that might not be something we would want to discuss and then maybe move forward with a recommendation if it warrants it.
It has been since 2009, and it's something we have talked about. I've talked about with the Finance and Utility Commissions. I think it's time. The feeling has been up to this point in time that with the sale of the electric utility pending, it's expensive, and why do that if we're going to divest ourselves of the utility in the next year or so. But back to Mr. Gorey's list of suggestions, one of the things that we will want to talk about you with in the context of those suggestions is it time to go do a rate study, a full-blown rate study?
And because I too, I mean, I would certainly welcome a reduction in the the power bill for the citizens of the city of Vero and our other users. But I too don't want it to be up and down. But I would also have to quickly say to you that I looked at your numbers, and whoever was doing the forecasting has been doing a wonderful job. You're only off 2 months, and one was up and one was down. It balanced out. So who knew it was going to be that cold, or that warm? But those numbers looked good. But I am concerned that we've done rate studies on other things, and maybe it's time to do it for the electric to make sure that we're including everything that we need to include. Because there is a difference between buying raw materials and producing power than just buying the power itself.
Back when in 2009, when PRMG did a full-blown rate study, there was actually some shift in the rate structure, and at that time we were just purchasing power, so they accounted for it then. But they did a full 10-year going forward pro forma. At that time, there was a fairly sizable, and I think we talked about it with the last rate sufficiency reduction in working capital, which they found alarming, and therefore, again, the rate structure and their 10-year forecast was predicated on getting back to that 90 days by 2013, 2014, and we're there. So we've pretty much trucked along with what they've suggested, but it's been what now, 5-6 years. Yeah. It's time. And again, our reluctance to do it was revolved around the sale, and why would we spend that kind of money? I mean, you're looking at probably $50,000 or $60,000 effort to do it. But when we have the meeting and we talk about the suggestions for that Mr. Gorey made and the staff analysis of those suggestions, we'd like to have that conversation about a rate consultant too, because we think maybe it's time to do that.
But aren't we still making about what the city council wants at about 6% return on equity on the electrical plant? In my mind, I looked at the return, and we're still only showing about a 6% return on power plant equity,
about 6%.
Which is lower than you would see certainly in other places. So,
but in the nature of a franchise fee percentage,
what's that?
It's about the same percentage as a franchise fee if we had a franchise provider.
Right.
There's a school of thought that says that's the right number there. Gainesville's been going through this recently in terms of how big their transfer is to their general fund from their utility. And I read one of the articles recently that said I think the statewide average municipal transfer is 5.9%, something right around 6%. So we're
right in the numbers in my mind.
Right in the right place.
Right in the numbers. We're not doesn't seem like we're skewed. When I look at the return on equity, it doesn't look like that.
And again, that's been a recent thing. If you look at years past, maybe 4 or 5 years back, it did kind of vary up and down depending on the needs of the general fund.
Right.
And it was Mr. O'Connor who said, let's make this based on something, and we went with the 6%, and that's where it stayed for the last few years. So it's not just sort of a backfill to what we need in the general fund.
When did they vote to go up on the rates, Cindy?
Let's see.
Just a few months ago, wasn't it?
I think our rate.
Time gets away from me.
No, we actually went down a few months ago. The history of this is we were at 74 back in December of 2012, up to 76.50 in November of 2013, back down to 75 in February of this year, and now we're suggesting 69.50. So we'll be back within a couple of dollars of where we were on the bulk power cost adjustment in January of 2012. So
November we
and
went
now
up.
we've been 1% down, 4%.
November we went up. February we went down. Okay, thank you.
But again, by pretty small amounts in either direction.
And we found, as I remember, that we were doing much better the first quarter than we thought, and that's why they came back down.
Coming back to the rate study concept, which, and I agree, I think we really evolved it to the point we need to do it. Most rate studies are going to find your cost allocation, and that's how they're going to, and Noah, you pointed out, doing the rate study really is the allocation on how we adjust our rates. And going back to the, where we were generating our own, we were able to control our peak. We really don't control our peaks now, and this is, Tom and I have had this conversation. One of the costs that we have from OUC, obviously, is that having the capacity charge that is assigned to us, and that capacity charge probably is assigned to some of our major users. So hopefully if we do this, the study, it's not only for our rates itself, but also the rate structure, and as long as we can keep that concept in mind, because that's really what's driving it. And if there's some means or method by which we can sort of control the peak and control our capacity cost, then hopefully it can drive some prices down in that respect as well. But that's been something we have not controlled over the past few years.
Wasn't there something, Tom, wasn't there something about the capacity cost that you brought up at the last meeting? Something about OUC and their part of that capacity cost or something?
Right. The capacity cost under the OUC contract is fixed by the contract. And it's reset once a year based on a forecasted demand, and then there's a subtraction from that that's a peak demand, and then it's a subtraction of our assets or our entitlements that we have from FMPA and our own plant combined cycle, and the remainder is the capacity that we have purchased from OUC. So that number is really fixed for 12 months, and then it's reset again based on a forecast that was done several months before. So for us to affect the peak, we really would be a long-term kind of an effort, where if you really felt like you wanted to try to reduce your peak costs, you could try to incentivize your customers with on-peak and off-peak rates. But it would take our costs actually today, because of all of our purchases, really don't reflect any peak costs or any.
Wasn't there something about, since OUC was a supplier, their peak shouldn't be calculated in that or something like that? You were saying that, hey, look, let me go back to that formula and see.
Yeah, there's some questions I have for OUC that I don't want to do right here, but that we need to talk with them about whether that's firm power or not firm, whether it needs to have a reserve requirement. That was the issue. Remember, there's a 15% reserve that we try to keep on top of our forecasted demand to cover outages and miscalculations on demand or extreme weather, which could cause our generation needs to be higher.
One of the things, though, in our contract, what we did is not really a coincident peak with them. We priced in a peak charge for the capacity charge based on hours, not necessarily in coincidence with OUC, which is where it really sort of a challenge for us. And unfortunately, the only way to really control peaking is through pricing. It has to really become a disincentive for somebody to start managing their peak. And unfortunately, when you go as many years as we have with not worrying about the peaking, we probably have some very large customers that don't concern themselves with that very much. So it's
our rate structure has one split at 1,000 kilowatt hours, where the usage rate goes up half again, and then there's no more tiers. So I mean, again, that's part of how do you set up that rate structure to disincentivize that?
Do any of our commercial customers use a peak load management system at all, Tom?
Most of them.
I would think Walmart and Home Depot certainly are well known for their, and Publix are well known for their.
Do we have a commercial peak load management for those guys?
Well, they do.
They do, because national firms are used to having
peak load management.
So they do that. But you can have, for example, a very small business here in town that does electric welding. And if they do electric arc welding, and they don't feel the penalty is too bad for their peak demand, they'll probably be out turning that thing on any time. And
plus, our demand threshold is 30 kW, and I know like FP&L's is 20. So, again, where you establish that also affects how many people you capture within your disincentivized to go above those peak demands. So, there's a lot of things to look at.
And ours, really, the peak is being set by OUC based on their forecast of how many megawatts are we going to need next year. And those forecasts are based on some load factor that we've had where we...
History.
History, that's correct.
Right, history.
And more importantly, if you were watching that Utility Commission meeting, what Tom had indicated, if I remember correctly, is that he thinks there will be about a $1.1 million increase next year in OUC's cost for that fixed amount. But keeping in mind that we also paid that loan off. And so for next year, we have a $1.1 million cost reduction for having no debt service next year. those two things kind of wash each other out, and therefore we still feel okay with this rate reduction because it's not going to immediately, not based on that anyway, spike back up in October. So.
And now with the economy getting better, the people have a tendency to have that spike in their demand.
Sure.
And so what we went from 96 to 93, and we're projected at 99 next year. Is
Yeah,
that
it's
what
100
it is?
next year. Right?
100 next year.
It's already set for next year.
So,
Calendar year.
yeah, calendar year.
Moving on, I think you're going to ask us, the committee, to recommend to the city council going down in rates. Do you need
Whether
that?
we should make the staff recommendation of 4.2% effective June 1. We need a motion and a vote from the committee as to whether they agree with that, and this will also go to the Utility Commission next Tuesday morning.
Can I
I'd
get
make
a
that motion, yes.
Dan,
Second.
second?
What's the reduction rate?
It goes from $75 to $69.50 per 1,000 kilowatt hours for the bulk power cost charge, and it's about 4.2% of a decrease on a 1,000 kilowatt hour bill.
You're good with that motion?
Yes, that's my.
Okay, yes, I'll second that.
Call the question. Ready? Everybody agreed?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, about the suggestion to at least consider a rate study, is anyone else here interested in pursuing that or not?
Excuse me, pursuing what?
The rate study for the electric.
It's actually kind of a good segue into the last item that I promised Mr. Gorey that I would bring up, which is one of the things that was not on this agenda is we did receive, after the informal discussion you had at your last meeting, a list of 18 items that might help us to affect some cost reductions in the electric utility. And they range everywhere from things that we already did or are doing to things like decommissioning the power plant. And so staff is working on an analysis of that to bring it back to you to discuss. And the discussion about a rate study is part of that discussion.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And
thank you.
it'll be part of what we discuss in our recommendation and analysis. So I think that'd be a perfect time to tackle that one.
Okay.
Plus, I don't think we could get the city to approve a $50,000 charge.
It's part of the reason that I haven't come and said.
saying
I've
that.
brought it up a few times, and everyone goes, "Oh no, no, no," and I'm like,
I know
"Okay,
you-
I'm not going to be the one to come with a
Well, the
$50,000
bottom line is, though, you may recoup that plus more if you when you go through the rate study. So, I mean, you don't know, but you don't know what you don't know sometimes.
Well, and the rate study really, though, is more in the nature of, right now, our philosophy on this rates efficiency, we're doing a pretty good job of forecasting billed revenue based on rates. And revenues have to be bigger than expenses. That's pretty simple, and we're doing that. A rate study might lead you to a place where you're still going to take in the same amount of revenue. You have to. But you're going to get it from different places. And that's where you start talking about incentivizing behavior and creating rate structures that help us manage our peak and ultimately lower costs that way.
Right.
So that's a whole other undertaking than just making sure you adjust the rate so you cover your expenses. And there's a big shift in philosophy, I think, is possible. So I guess my question would be, could we talk about maybe scheduling that meeting for a month or so for now and talk about some dates?
Whenever you guys are ready, we'll talk. And we're getting close to budget season, right?
It's already started. Inside, it's already started about a month ago. But yes, we are. I would say sometime toward the middle of June, which means it won't run up against our budget hearings with council that are in the first part of July.
So as scheduled, our next meeting is first week of June, right?
No.
No?
You would have your next regular meeting would be your next quarterly meeting, which would be
July.
first
Right, I don't
week
think
of
we scheduled it. I mean, we can look at it and
first week of August.
Okay.
If everyone's okay, if anyone has any major vacation plans or whole periods of time they're going to be gone, if you would let Sherry know, and then we'll see what we can do to schedule around it. Just basically a nod that everyone's interested in having that separate special meeting aside from your quarterly meeting to talk about the electric utility in depth and some of the cost savings for next year. Yeah.
Sure.
I have a question about just how we interface on the budget thing. I don't understand.
what we did last year and what we'll most likely do again this year is the first crack at the budget goes to the city council. They will have workshops from July the 7th through July the 11th where they will look at the city manager's proposed budget in detail. Then what happened last year is once that they had those detailed discussions, they sent it back also to the Finance Commission for, I think we had a meeting sometime end of July, first part of August, for any comments and inputs that you had before final adoption in September. So, but typically, again, because it's the city manager's proposal and it's the council's policy document, it goes to city council, first, so that they can weigh in on what they want, what their priorities are before it goes to the commissions.
Are we usually kind of expected to be at these budget talks of the city council or not?
No, that's entirely at your discretion.
Okay.
It's 4 solid days, so I don't know.
Yeah.
You're not expected to be there.
Any further questions? I suggest we call a close to the meeting. Everybody agree with that?
Yes,
Good move.
we're good.
Good.
All right.
Thank you very much, gang. It was
Good
good.
meeting.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah. Thank you. Cindy, you did a great job as usual.
Thank you. I really do appreciate everyone taking the time to really talk about the CAFR because I
Yeah.
get really excited about that. So
Peter, you take care.
throw a piece of paper at me.
On that discussion of ownership.
Sorry, I'll wait.
from the audience, that
Yeah, sure,
we
sure.
don't have liabilities on the other plants, because we really don't know that. It's under control of someone else. But just contractually, we have ownership as can be defined as ownership under those contracts.
Well-
Leasing is a good way of putting it, but I think it's a lease, what do they call that? Value, leasehold value.
Well, that's
What-
actually our statement. Those are our notes. And I will tell you from an accounting standpoint,
Yeah, right.
we have no ownership of those assets.
Right.
We do not have from an accounting standpoint, a basis on which to book their assets
Right.
in our.
Sure, you could put it on a
We're
balance
not a
sheet.
component unit of them. So this is really more from an accounting standpoint, making it clear that even though we're involved with them, we're not a component unit in either direction, and their books are their books, and our books are our books, and they stand alone, and we're not reflecting any of their assets. This is a very pedantic accounting look at it. What we're talking about here is more the contractual situation.
Are we a percentage owner of FMPA?
Actually, we're a co-op, we're not really a percentage owner, because I'm not sure there's an ownership of it.
So they're all equal owners, so to speak?
Yeah, everybody, well, there's a book different.
FMPA is actually
Yeah.
You have shares? No.
You know,
There's
it would have been,
votes, depending on where you are.
it would have been nice. And
Oh, I'm sorry. We're stressing Sherry out. We should be either not adjourned or adjourned. I didn't hear a motion to adjourn, so I suppose
did.
we're
We did.
adjourned.
We
We're
did.
adjourned. Yeah, you don't.
you could go to their website and look at their CAFR.
All right.